In the catalog for the exhibition whose centennial we gather to mark here today, the authors rightly note that the exhibition of contemporary Scandinavian art in 1912 and 1913 has been lost historically in the considerable shadow cast by the legendary International Exhibition of Modern Art, the so-called Armory Show. Nevertheless, the catalog contributors collectively posit, I assume collectively posit, that the Scandinavian show, and I quote, helped to pave the way for the Armory Show's more radical offerings and for the assimilation of European modernism in North America. Rather than consider the two exhibitions as, respectively, the opening act and the main event on a two-party ticket of the early history of modernism in the United States, I am more interested in juxtaposing them, more specifically their critical reception as a means of illuminating the particular set of cultural variables relating to the perceived intersection of race and artistic practice in the early 20th century. Both shows opened and toured against a backdrop of mounting anxieties among economically and politically enfranchised, mostly Anglo-Saxon, groups in the US concerned with the condition of and the presumed degeneration of the country's collective gene pool, changes that were symptomatic of shifting patterns of immigration from the mid-19th to the early 20th century. Diminishing immigration from Northern Europe and concomitant increasing immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe stoked perceived fears among empowered and enfranchised constituencies in the United States that white America was under siege. In this context, the promotion and reception of the show and artists of Scandinavian descent corroborated the relative desirability of the Northern presence in the country's collective gene pool. For confirmation of the healthy character of Scandinavian artists and their art, critics and novice art lovers alike need look no further than the exhibition's catalog, whose authors testified repeatedly to the inherent and desirable vitality of Northern artists and their art. As Christian Petersen observed in the catalog introduction, looking at the art on view, and I quote, "You instinctively feel an exhilarating sense of direct communication with nature and natural forces. You note the naive zest of the healthy, unfatigued sensibilities for fresh, tonic color contrasts, and you feel the thrill of eternal aspiration and this fondness for great open spaces and the magic of radiance of the Arctic aurora." Carl Lauren echoed Brenton's introductory observations in his discussion of Anders Zorn in The Art of Sweden, in his section, The Art of Sweden, in which he described the famed Swedish painter as, quote, preeminently the painter of the Dalklarian people, that sturdy stronghold of the Swedish nation, and withal of the Swedish peasant woman, full of health, vigor, and unconscious sensuality, and fresh and hearty as a ripe cherry. Sweden, Lauren concluded, is a peasant country, and we are proud to possess a race of peasants which has for thousands of years, been healthy, free, and self-reliant. I don't know if she's a peasant, but she helps to make my point. That Scandinavian art exemplified racial health was shared among observers far beyond the contributors to the Scandinavian catalog. Margaret Steele Anderson, author of Study of Modern Painting of 1914, concluded in her study of the so-called lesser countries by noting that, quote, with an element that is ominously fantastic and even weird, the art of Scandinavia has yet a healthy body. To put it more clearly, she has a large number of sane and high-minded painters for whom the portrayal of their own country and people is a matter of first importance. Such favorable reviews were both sign and symptom of larger contemporaneous concerns and debates regarding the changing racial character of immigration in the United States. Indeed, advocacy of Scandinavian art and artists on the presumed bases of racial health found sympathetic minds and hearts among those non-art professionals who were simultaneously lamenting the present trends in immigration away from Northern Europe. Scholar and scientist Roswell H Johnson was among the rising scores of cultural figures who expressed concerns about the changing complexion and character of contemporary immigration. As everyone knows, Johnson conveyed in the pages of Popular Science Monthly, the old immigrations to our shores of such kindred stocks as the Irish, and hold on, like throw on the brakes, the Irish, kindred stocks in the 1840s and 50s, it's the most, yeah, anyway, that's a whole nother topic. Germans and Scandinavians has gradually given way to an influx of inferior peoples from Southern and Central Europe, and more recently to the great stream of Asiatic and Eastern European folk that are now beating, some of them ineffectually, at our doors. Shall we continue and extend the policy of already inaugurated of excluding undesirable stocks? Dr. Alfred C. Read of the U.S. Public Health Service at Ellis Island raised similar concerns and questions regarding immigration's adverse effects on America's racial outlook and future health. Writing also in Popular Science Monthly, Read exclaimed, as you see here in the quote, "America is the land of the alien, and even now his mark is plain on all our institutions. But while the principal increase in population has been immigration, the character of that immigration has changed markedly in the past 30 years. Previously to 1883, Western and Northern Europe sent a stalwart stock, 95% of which of all who came. They sought new homes and were settlers. Scandinavians, Danes, Dutch, Germans, French, and Swiss, and the English islanders. They were the best of Europe's blood. They were industrious, patriotic, and far-sighted. They were productive and constructive workers. Where nothing had been, they planted and mined and built and toiled with their hands, while yet finding time to educate their children and train them to love their new mother country and appreciate the blessings she furnished." The same kind of quasi-scientifically validated racism and xenophobia that framed public debates about shifting immigration patterns seeped into the critical reception of modernism, exemplified by the spectacle of the Armory Show. The most famous and explicit alignment of perceived spurious bloodlines and artistic ideas remains Royal Cortezas' American Artists, an historical study published in 1923, but very much informed by the conservative critics' impressions of changes in the art world, the American art world, over the preceding 10 years. Quoting from that study, "Art is subjected to strong-arm methods now, and she gets it in the neck. She gets it there at the hands of so many contributors to the exhibitions of Society of Independent Artists," which is the organization that took over from the organization that outlived the organization that organized the Armory Show. There is something in this art situation analogous to what has been going to what has been so long going on in our racial melting pot. The United States is invaded by aliens, thousands of whom constitute so many acute perils to the health of the body politic. Modernism is of precisely the same heterogeneous alien origin and is imperiling the Republic of Art in the same way. Impressionism and post-impressionism, he's implying in this quote, have been promoted by types not yet fitted for their first papers in aesthetic naturalization, the makers of true Ellis Island art. However extraordinary in its bluntness, Cortezas' racist dismissal of modernism was symptomatic of larger trends in art criticism, in which the concepts and terms used to pathologize new immigrant populations were appropriated to stigmatize, if not outright demonize, new ideas and forms in art. And so I'm constantly on the lookout of these, and you rarely find one so explicit as Royal Cortezas, but I'm fascinated by these sorts of juxtapositions. Is this deliberate? Is it accidental? And what are the effects? Either way. But this is an excerpt from the Medical Sentinel of June 1913, so right in the moment of the Armory Show. The top bit of the excerpt here is an article that's about the need for eugenics, and you can see it says, with a growing number among the insane and the feeble-minded, blah, 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 we need to, stick to our guns, otherwise this trend is going to continue. And the same column is an article about the Armory Show. So I can't help but wonder if this is less than accidental. So terms and concepts that recur include concern for health, this concern for perceived deviancy, sanity, all of which were tied to the catch-all term used to justify eugenic intervention, which was feeble-mindedness. shifting gears here, second part. Despite some scattered accusations of color and form run afoul in the Scandinavian show in 1912, immigrant artists from northern countries, generally speaking, found favorable conditions for cultural expression and assimilation in the United States under the conditions I've just laid out. So at this point, I just want to touch on Birger Sandzen from Sweden, an artist with whom I happen to have a personal connection through my education, Christian Petersen from Denmark, and lastly, I'm going to touch more extensively on US-Finnish relations in the 1930s as suggested by a particular painting by American modernist Marston Hartley, whose name has already been invoked and discussed. This is Birger Sandzen, born in Pillsburg, attended school in Skara. In 1891, he moved to Stockholm with the hopes of entering the Royal Academy, but he entered into study instead with Anders Zorn, Richard Berg, and Per Hasselberg. And I should have apologized at the very front for my butchering all of these pronunciations. So some of this is new material for me. It'll get better. The first time I've said some of these in public, not just by myself in the front of the mirror. In 1894, he's off to Paris, studied in the studio of Edmond Francois Armand Jean, a painter in the circle of Georges Seurat. But later that year, far from the City of Lights, he pursues an opportunity at the age of 23 to teach languages at the fledgling Bethany College in Lindsborg, Kansas, where I happened to go to undergraduate school. In fact, an embarrassing anecdote of my youth is that when I first arrived on campus, not knowing much about the world beyond my native Kansas, I confused Cézanne with Sandzen, and I knew that there was a great artist by the name of Cézanne, and I confused the names. I had no idea this guy was from Kansas. So back on track. And he had read about Bethany College in Lindsborg by a book that had been published back at home by the college's first president, Carl Svensson. So here are kids performing as they do every year at Hillingsfest, traditional Swedish dances, Swedish welcomes everywhere along the interstate and as you pull off. The view below, that dark yellow building is the Finnish pavilion of the World's Fair of 1904 in St. Louis, which sits adjacent to a park in Lindsborg. It's a little surreal, I admit. And Carl Svensson, whom I just invoked, is represented in the sculpture there that is now in front of the main administrative building at the college. Sandzen taught there for 52 years. He was made a Knight of the Royal Order of Vasa for promotion of cultural relations between Sweden and the US. Here are a couple of works by him from what I think is his best decade, from the 1920s. He painted scenery throughout central and western Kansas and parts farther west, including Colorado and Utah. He escaped Kansas during the summer months because he couldn't take the heat, so he's off into the mountains and loved Colorado as well. At a far remove from art centers, major metropolitan art centers, Sandzen enjoyed limited opportunities for recognition for his art beyond his immediate region, but the American Scandinavian Society here promoted him and his work and sponsored some shows, allowing for greater audiences and exposure. And here, these are such signature works with these heavily impastoed surfaces, deeply saturated color, and I don't have time to describe them too much, but I think they are interesting in the sense that, as I mentioned before, you do find these instances where Sandzen's work is received in the language that I've laid out previously, where this is a review from a show of watercolors sponsored by the Philadelphia Watercolor Club, and Sandzen is being favorably reviewed in terms of sanity. It's critiquing a woman artist, Lizelle, who paints in a Cubist style and saying it's now we're going to turn to the better and saner art of Birger Sandzen. So touching now for just a few minutes on Christian Petersen. a Dane who immigrated to the States and also, like Sandzen, found a home for his art and a community for his art in the Midwest. He's born in Dyvel, Denmark. 1894, he immigrated to the US with his parents to New Jersey, and he apprenticed to a die cutter. 1907, he studied here in New York at the Art Students League, lived thereafter in Massachusetts, working as a die cutter, started supporting himself through portrait commissions in bronze well into the 1920s. And during the Depression, Petersen met Raymond Hughes, who's president of the Iowa Agriculture State College, which is now Iowa State University in Ames. And Iowa officials recommended Petersen to Grant Wood to work on the federal Public Works of Art program, which was, of course, as many of you know, is part of President Franklin FDR's New Deal. In 1934, he worked briefly for the PWAP before moving to Ames, where he became sculptor in residence at the college for many, many years. The campus at Iowa or at Ames is covered in his work. Here's the Fountain of the Four Seasons. One of the largest works is this, which is the backdrop. The relief in low relief is veterinary medicine, and the figure in the round in the foreground, which extends on the theme, is the gentle doctor. A lot of his work adorns the animal husbandry divisions of the school and the veterinary medicine division of the school. And I'm interested in these, again, in this larger context of eugenics in the US. The rule subjects do tie, whoops. This is my favorite, the Cornhusker modeled 1941. The rule subject does suggest ties to American regionalism in the 1930s. We'll touch back here to American Gothic as a canonical image of American regionalism. But Petersen, like artists associated with the movement, scoffed at the term regionalism. He would have nothing to do with it, although it was used during his lifetime and obviously still now. The Cornhusker, like I said, is one of my favorite, most interesting, I think one of the most interesting works by him. It's an image of a known champion Cornhusker, although his name escapes me at the moment. But I think the point of the work here, where you have the single figure who's striding forward, not unlike the Nike of Samoth race, only in an Iowa cornfield, the work aligns strong bodies with strong crops, in this case corn. This conceptual alignment is relevant in light of the fact that Iowa Agriculture State College was, like many agricultural schools, a hotbed of eugenics thinking. This also just say, obviously, it's like the most phallic cob of corn you'll ever see on any work of art. Harry H. Laughlin, who was the director of the Eugenics Record Office in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. Cold Spring Harbor, New York was the home base of the American eugenics movement. And the director, Harry Laughlin, was a graduate of the school of Iowa Agriculture College. And Charles F. Curtis, eulogized here, exalted here, who was the dean of the School of Agriculture during Petersen's tenure. He served on the American Breeders Association, which was an arm of the American eugenics movement. That's his name on that roster, the record on the right. Corn here is interesting in the eugenics context. Corn is obviously the crop most associated with the state of Iowa, but corn also figured prominently in eugenic research and experiments. Corn is easily hybridized. It was hybridized really early in the 19th century. And here is an experiment using corn to study color inheritance. Here is an image of some of the grounds at Cold Spring Harbor in New York, which includes in the middle ground cornfields. So they're growing corn so they can study it and study inheritance and how that's passed on. And I want to just finish by saying a few words about Marston Hartley in this painting, which is very odd, Finnish Sauna from 1938-39. If you're interested in this work, I've published on it, and hope I can help you find citations. But this work is interesting in talking about US and Finnish relations in the late 1930s. There was a love affair between Finland and the US that really began in the early part of the decade. And this picture is playing a part in that. Hartley, just for a little bit of context, is best known for this work, Portrait of a German Officer from 1914, which hangs just farther north here in town, farther uptown, though I don't know if it's on view at the Met right now. They're changing after some exhibitions. But it's an abstract portrait of a man that Hartley loved who was killed in World War I. The later work by Hartley tends to be more figurative and, to our eyes, more explicitly homoerotic, like this work, Finnish Sauna. So I set to work a few years ago, try to figure out what is going on here. Is he indulging in just sort of homoerotic subject matter? Is this fantasy? What is going on here? As it turns out, there is, of course, a Finnish population, although not as large as I expected when I got into this research in Maine. Hartley in his late work was sort of exploring what it meant to be, what Maine was like, again, in kind of regionalism, although in northeastern regionalism. Andrew Wyeth's picture from 1968 is sort of extending this idea. What I think is interesting here, though, is that for the Wyeth's picture, the sauna is relegated to the past. Wyeth is using this sauna as a studio. It's defunct. It's non-functional. It's not functioning. She's just sitting in it, and she's of Finnish extraction, but she seems to have no particular connection to her environment. These men, by contrast, are natural byproducts of what the sauna provides you, which is strenuous health, makes you stronger, and so on and so forth. And I know I'm running short of time, so I'm going to move through this a little bit quicker. They are ostensibly twins, or in this case, quadruplets. Lighthorn eugenic scientists were really interested in studying multiple births, twins, triplets, and quadruplets. As you see in this article, that's the backdrop for the painting now. Not coincidentally, in Germany, German eugenicists were studying twins and quadruplets, and I think that you get this this obsession with racial and genetic homogeneity is so much a hallmark of the art that was produced under under National Socialism. Hitler actually even awarded parents of quadruplets of money and awards, and he adopted, became the, as you can see here, became the godfather of quadruplets because it was a key to the master race, I guess. They were also, multiple births were control groups for studying genetic issues of heredity. But for US audiences, the love affair with Finland in the 1930s really began in the early 30s because Finland started paying off its war debt from World War I sooner than any other European country. So the US was mired in the Depression, and here this little northern country starts paying off its war debt, standing up to its obligations, and they earned great popular acclaim for this action and say, oh, the French are defaulting, but look at little Finland standing up and doing what's right. So there's a great long-standing love affair. But Finland is also exalted in the US popular media for the perception that Finland was racially pure. And it comes out in multiple instances. You can see excerpts of quotes here. It's no small thing for a nation of 3 million people to have preserved its racial integrity for 1,000 years. All the Finns are fit, they're healthy, and so on and so forth. Hartley's turn to Finnish themes, not coincidentally, coincides with the 300-year anniversary of the first known Finnish settlement in the US, which was widely commemorated throughout the East Coast, especially 1938, 39, as he's painting these Finnish themes. And in this context, the Finnish sauna is represented in multiple ways that, for me, was really revelatory. There's more flesh exposed in magazines like Collier's, as you see here, National Geographic, which I guess you sort of expect at this point, but Life magazine and others are going into the Finnish sauna, and exalting the Finnish sauna is the key means by which Finns have retained their racial integrity for so long. Here, just more to that point. This photo at the bottom of the men going in or just coming out of the sauna, I guess going in, is during the Winter War, and so it's sort of life in Finland. They're holding on to their traditions even at this terrible point in time. And also note the heading at the top, Finns are clean. They look kind of sweaty to me at the moment, but clean, I guess. But the point here is that, that the sauna in this context, operated ostensibly as a kind of eugenic laboratory where switches and pails replace stethoscopes and other medical devices that you might see in a eugenics laboratory. And Hartley, in that painting, I suggest, has created, if only in paint, a kind of master race, which was a project that crossed nations and boundaries in the late 1930s. So I'm ending on a sort of a grim note, but thank you for your time. And again, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the invitation to participate. It's been a blast. Okay.